I never used to believe all those scary stories you hear about in the Appalachian Mountains, until a reunion camping trip that changed the way I look at the wilderness altogether. This all happened about a year ago, when my best friend Matt, my wife Emily, and Matt's wife Sarah went on a hunting trip close to the Cherokee National Forest. Matt and I had been planning it for months, 5 days in the mountains, camping at his family's old hunting cabin. The plan was simple. A couple of days out in nature, some hunting, a few drinks by the fire, just an excuse to get away from the hubbub and commotion of work and city life. I haven't been camping since. None of us have, and I don't think we ever will again. We arrived late in the afternoon, driving up through winding dirt roads in my camper van. The plan had always been to take one vehicle. Gas was expensive, and we figured it'd be more fun to road trip together anyway. Matt and I had been best friends since high school, and we don't see each other as often anymore, so this was supposed to be a chance to catch up. It was mid-December, right at that point where winter fully settles in. But the worst snowstorms haven't hit yet. The temperatures had been hovering just below freezing for days, and the whole landscape was covered in a thin but solid layer of snow. Not deep enough to make driving impossible, but enough to keep the ground frozen and hold footprints. The drive up was long and uneventful. 5 hours of open highways, gas station stops, and shitty diner food. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the roads got narrower, rougher, and more remote. Cell service faded to nothing, and the dense trees pressed in from all sides, heavy with ice and the weight of old snow. The sky was that dull, grayish-blue winter color, the kind that makes the sun disappear faster than you expect. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was already slipping behind the trees, and the temperature had dropped to that sharp, biting cold that settles right before dark. The road up had been rough, just miles of winding dirt trails, thick forest pressing in from both sides, and the occasional patch of ice that made the van's tires slide just enough to make you nervous. I remember feeling relieved when the cabin finally came into view. That feeling lasted about 3 seconds. The front door was wide open. None of us spoke at first. I know we were all thinking the same thing, but no one wanted to be the one to say it, because saying it out loud made it real. Matt was the first to break the silence. I remember him mumbling something about maybe an animal, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Sarah immediately jumped to, "Did you forget to lock up last time?" But Matt was adamant that he didn't. I didn't know what to think, but once we got closer, I knew one thing. The door hadn't been forced open. The frame wasn't broken, the handle wasn't busted, it was just open. Matt and I grabbed our rifles and went in first, telling Emily and Sarah to wait in the van until we checked things out. The second we stepped inside, I felt it. The air was just off. Not just cold, because obviously it was winter, but something else. It felt still like the space itself was holding its breath, heavy almost, like stepping into a basement that hasn't been opened in years, where the air just sits and waits. It settled weirdly in my chest, and I had the urge to just turn around and leave, but nothing seemed disturbed. No signs of a break-in, no furniture knocked over, and no obvious damage. Then we saw it, there, in the middle of the living room, lying perfectly still on the wooden floor. A dead owl. At first I just stared, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. It wasn't torn apart like something had eaten it. It wasn't freshly killed either. The thing had been gutted, its insides pulled out, leaving a dark stain on the floor, but it hadn't been scattered like a predator got to it. It was clean, too clean, like something had cut it open, scooped it out, and left it there. Matt said perhaps it had got stuck in the cabin and died and a scavenger had found it, but I could tell he didn't really believe that. I sure as heck didn't. If a coyote or some other scavenger had gotten in, wouldn't it have eaten the whole thing, left mess or tracks, knocked something over? None of that was there. For a few long moments, we just stood there, looking at it, both of us feeling that creeping sense of unease settle in. Eventually, Matt just picked it up by the wings, like it was nothing. Took it out back. We'd both decided it was best not to let the girls see it. I stayed inside to wipe up the mess, trying not to think about how much this didn't make sense. I was still cleaning the floor when I heard the van door slam. Emily and Sarah had gotten tired of waiting. Sarah was the first one in, immediately complaining about how cold it was inside. Emily followed, stopping when she saw me crouched on the floor, wet rag in hand, blood stain halfway scrubbed out. She asked what happened, and I told her the truth. Their reactions were about what you'd expect: disgusted, confused, and slightly freaked out. Sarah kept pushing Matt on whether he actually locked the place, but the locks weren't broken and nothing was missing. He swore up and down that he hadn't left the door unlocked. At that point, there wasn't much else to do but move on. The sun was almost gone, and we still had to unpack. Matt got the cabin generator running, which was kept in a small shed about 15 to 20 feet from the cabin's back door. By the time the cabin filled with warm light, the unease from earlier had started to fade. We had dinner, played some cards, joked around a little. By the time we went to bed, I had almost convinced myself we were just overreacting. That first night was quiet, or at least, it was until it wasn't. I remember lying in bed staring up at the wooden beams of the cabin ceiling, half listening to the muffled sounds of the generator outside. That steady, distant hum was oddly comforting, like white noise blocking out the empty silence of the woods. Matt and Sarah were in the other bedroom across from us. Emily was next to me, already half asleep, and everything felt normal. Or at least I was trying to convince myself that it was, even though the open door earlier still nagged at me, even though the dead owl was still burned into my brain. But nothing else had happened, so I pushed it away. Eventually, I drifted off. I don't know how long I was asleep before I felt Emily shake my arm. I groggily opened my eyes. She whispered, "I think there's something on the roof." That woke me up, not all the way, but enough to register what she was saying. I lay there, listening, my ears straining past the distant hum of the generator, past the creaks of the cabin settling, wind hissing softly against the windows. I remember mumbling something dismissive, but can't remember exactly what. She was quiet for a long time after that, but I could tell she was still wide awake. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, Emily must have still been thinking about it because she brought it up over breakfast, casually at first. "That was weird last night, huh?" But I could tell she wasn't really joking. I asked what exactly she'd heard, and she just kind of shrugged and said it sounded like something walking. She threw out a bear theory, which got a reaction out of Matt. He looked up from his coffee, raising an eyebrow, like he was waiting for the punchline. Then he just shook his head and said, "Yeah, no. A bear on the roof? Not happening?" That was about as much conversation as we had about it, because realistically, it had to have been an animal, and it's easier to let things go when you have a whole day ahead of you, hiking, exploring, trying to enjoy the trip. So we moved on. We finished breakfast, went for a short hike, and spent some time just enjoying the quiet. Everything felt normal again. I don't know why, but I remember the sound of the creek in the distance that day. It was one of those things you don't notice at the time, but later, when you look back, you remember weird details, the way the water sounded too far away when I knew it wasn't. The way the woods were quiet, but not in a peaceful way, just still. At the time, though, I wasn't thinking about that. I was just grabbing the rest of our stuff from the camper van, humming something under my breath. At some point, I started whistling, and that's when it happened. Somewhere in the trees behind the van, the same tune whistled back at me. At first, I thought it was Matt. I even called out, expecting him to step out from the trees, laughing, but he answered from inside the cabin, and I felt this sudden, uneasy feeling in my gut. I stood there for a second, just listening. I don't know what I expected to hear next. Footsteps? A branch snapping? Nothing happened. The tree line was completely still. I forced myself to finish unpacking and didn't mention it to anyone at first. I don't even know why I didn't say anything. Maybe because it felt stupid, like maybe I had imagined it. But I kept glancing back toward the woods for the rest of the day. I never saw anything. By the time the sun started dipping behind the trees, Matt and I had already talked through our plans for the next day. The idea was simple: get up early, set up in a good spot, and wait for deer. That meant tonight was mostly for relaxing, but we did want to do a bit of scouting before dark. We left Emily and Sarah at the cabin and took our rifles out to check the area, making note of the best vantage points. The woods had that strange quiet again, the kind you don't really notice at first, but the longer you go without hearing a single bird or rustling branch, the more it starts to feel wrong. We didn't go far, maybe half a mile from the cabin, sticking to the edge of a ridge where we'd have a good view the next morning. There were plenty of old tracks in the snow, deer trails cutting through the trees, a few fresh prints leading toward a stream down below. It was exactly what we were looking for. Then we heard it, a scream, high-pitched, sharp, and distant. It echoed through the trees, stretching out into the stillness around us. It took me a second too long to process what I was hearing. The sound didn't fit the landscape. Matt and I both froze. There was a moment where neither of us moved. Then another scream, same pitch, same distance. Something in my brain immediately latched onto the worst-case scenario. One of our wives. I could feel Matt thinking the same thing. The cabin wasn't that far away. We stood there, listening. Nothing. I asked Matt if we should check it out. He didn't answer right away. Then, just as I took a step toward the sound, he grabbed my arm and said we needed to leave. I didn't understand why at first. But then I saw where he was looking at the ground. There were footprints in the snow. Not boot prints, not animal tracks, bare human footprints, leading from the tree line toward where the scream had come from. I don't remember making the decision to leave. I just remember walking, fast, back toward the cabin. We didn't run, but I could feel it, that urge to break into a sprint, to move faster than whatever might be watching us. The whole way back, I kept thinking about the scream, how wrong it had sounded, like something trying to sound human, but not quite getting it right. We got back to the cabin, and the girls were exactly where we left them. No one had screamed. Sarah tried to tell us it was probably a fox. She sounded convinced. But even then, I could see Matt wasn't buying it. I wasn't either. We locked up that night, played some board games, drank a little, and tried to forget about it. For a while, I almost did. After breakfast the next morning, we decided to go on another hike. Nothing major, just a few miles along one of the old trails near the ridge. Emily and Sarah wanted to stretch their legs before Matt and I went out hunting, so it made sense to do something as a group before splitting off for the afternoon. The hike itself was fine. The air was cold but fresh. The woods felt open. And for a while, it actually felt like we were on a normal trip. We didn't talk much about the screaming from the night before. I think we all wanted to move past it. After a couple of hours, we made it back to the cabin, and Emily and Sarah decided to stay in for the rest of the day. Neither of them had any interest in hunting, and it wasn't like they could go anywhere with the lack of cell service. So, around mid-afternoon, Matt and I grabbed our rifles and headed out. The plan was simple: set up at some of the spots we found last night and wait for deer. At first, everything felt normal. It was colder than yesterday, but not in a way that felt unusual. The air was crisp, the sky was dull and overcast, and the snow crunched underfoot as we hiked back toward the ridge where we had scouted. But as soon as we got into position, something felt off. I don't even know how to describe it. It wasn't creepy exactly, not at first, just empty. We settled in, rifles ready, waiting for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. For hours, no distant branches snapping, no deer rustling through the underbrush, not even the occasional sound of a bird taking off. We moved spots a couple of times, checking a few game trails, but it was the same everywhere. No tracks, no movement, no life. It didn't make sense. The ridge should have been prime hunting ground, and yet, it was like every deer in the area had disappeared. I could tell Matt was getting frustrated. Eventually, he said he didn't want to waste the trip. And that's when he mentioned the thermal scope. He had brought it along mostly to try it out. It was brand new, and he'd been talking about using it for weeks. Since we couldn't hunt deer at night, he suggested we set up a hide for coyote hunting instead. It made sense, but I did feel uneasy about being out fully after dark, and almost solely reliant on the thermal scope for vision. But we hiked back to the cabin, got some supplies, told the girls our plan, and headed back out. toward a good spot near the clearing, and waited for night to fall. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, the temperature had dropped sharply. The clouds had thickened overhead, turning the sky into a flat, dull gray, making the early darkness feel even heavier than usual. We made our way to the spot we had scouted earlier, moving carefully through the woods to avoid making too much noise. Coyotes weren't as skittish as deer, but they weren't stupid either. We wanted to be set up and quiet before they started moving. The forest was a different place after dark. It wasn't just that it was harder to see, it was the stillness. During the day it had felt empty and lifeless, but now it felt like something was holding its breath. It was an odd thing to notice, but as we settled in and went quiet, I realized the usual night sounds weren't there. No distant owl calls, no rustling in the underbrush, no wind moving through the trees, just silence. We didn't talk much once we were in position, just short, quiet phrases, checking our angles, waiting. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, a little after 9:16 p.m., Matt shifted beside me. He had been scanning with the thermal scope, shifting slowly from left to right, watching for any heat signatures in the darkness. At first, I thought he had spotted something normal, a coyote finally. But then I noticed how still he had gotten. There was a long pause before he handed me the rifle, whispering for me to look through the scope. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to see, maybe a big coyote, something out of place, but when I adjusted the focus, it took me a second to even understand what I was looking at. At first, I thought it was two coyotes moving low through the brush. Then one of them stood up. It was a person with no clothes and bare skin against the snow. The other figure was still on all fours, creeping forward like it hadn't quite figured out how to walk yet. The standing one wasn't moving like a normal person. It was too smooth, too quiet, like it was a big cat stalking its prey. Then, as I adjusted the focus, I realized something else. The second figure, the one on the ground, was getting closer to the trees. It wasn't running, it wasn't stumbling, it was slinking, moving low like it was trying not to be seen. Then the standing figure opened its mouth and screamed. Not a normal scream, not a coyote, not a fox. A woman's voice. It was too far away to be that clear, but I heard it anyway, sharp and cutting through the silence. "Someone, please help me." The voice didn't match the way the figure was standing. It sounded too rehearsed. The second figure, the one creeping into the trees, moved again. Then another scream. But now, it wasn't coming from the standing one. It was coming from the one in the trees. The same voice, the exact same tone, like something playing a recording. My stomach dropped. Matt exhaled through his teeth. Neither of us moved. For a few long, agonizing moments, we just watched, and the standing figure didn't move. The crawling one had fully disappeared into the trees, and the silence pressed in around us. Then, another cry. "Someone, please help me." From somewhere else this time, we didn't wait any longer. Moving carefully at first, then faster, we slipped out of the hide, rifles close, walking as quietly as possible. Neither of us said a word. I could feel something watching us the entire way back. We didn't run, not until we saw the cabin, and that's when it happened. That same blood-curdling scream from the night before. Only now, it was closer. We ran the last stretch, reaching the porch just as the sound ripped through the trees again. When we slammed the door behind us, Emily and Sarah were already on their feet. They had heard it too, and this time, even Sarah didn't try to explain it away. I don't know how long we sat there after locking the doors, but no one wanted to be the first to say anything. It wasn't like there was much to say. Emily and Sarah had heard the scream too. It had been close, closer than before. No one tried to write it off this time. Not a fox, not a coyote, not anything that should have been out there. We turned on every light in the cabin, which made us feel safer for a little while. Even though we knew that if something wanted to come inside, it might not be stopped by a locked door and some warm lamplight. There was this unspoken agreement that we weren't going to go outside, not until morning, not after what we had just seen in the woods. Eventually, we all head upstairs to bed, and I must have fallen asleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the room was completely silent, and I realized I had to piss. I stayed in bed for a while, trying to ignore it, but eventually I gave in. The bathroom was downstairs, right near the back door, which I wasn't thrilled about, but I wasn't about to piss myself either. The cabin was quiet as I made my way down the stairs. I finished in the bathroom and was about to head back upstairs when I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. A slow, deliberate knocking on the back door's window. I froze. The blind over the small glass pane was drawn, so I couldn't see who or what was there. And then I heard Emily's voice. "Please, it's so cold out here. I'm hurt. Please let me in." For a second, my brain couldn't process it. I knew Emily was upstairs. I had just left her in bed. But the voice, it was perfect, right down to the way she always sounded when she was upset. I took a slow step toward the door. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to hear it again, to be sure I wasn't dreaming. "Tom, please, open the door. I'm hurt. I need help." I felt a deep, sick feeling in my stomach, like my body had already figured out what was happening before my brain could catch up. I reached out and pulled the blind up. There was a woman standing there, pale and thin, her face almost pressed against the glass. Her eyes were wrong, too dark, too deep, and she was smiling. We stared at each other. I barely managed to choke out, "You're not my wife, go away." The smile disappeared, then she screamed. The sound was so loud, so raw, like she was dying on the other side of the glass. She started pounding on the door, slamming her fists against it so hard the frame shook. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet before I turned and ran upstairs. Matt was already awake when I burst into the room. I must have looked as bad as I felt, because the second he saw me, he grabbed his rifle and asked what was wrong. I could barely get the words out. "There's someone outside." By the time we got back downstairs, the pounding on the door had stopped, and the woman was gone. We checked every window, but there was nothing out there, just the cold and the dark, and then, without warning, the lights went out. For a second, no one moved, then Matt whispered, "They turned off the generator." I don't remember much of the next few minutes, just that we grabbed what we could and barricaded ourselves in one of the bedrooms upstairs. The girls were awake now too, asking what was happening, but I don't think I answered. My head was spinning too fast. We spent the rest of the night locked in our rooms listening. No one went outside, and at some point, I must have dozed off. But it wasn't real sleep. It was that half-conscious state where time slips away, where your brain keeps replaying things you don't want to think about. The knocking, the voice, the smile. Every time my eyes shut, I saw her face pressed against the glass. The generator was still off, which meant the cabin was freezing by morning. I remember seeing my breath when I finally sat up, my muscles aching from how tense I'd been all night. No one spoke much. We just sat there for a long time, not really looking at each other, just listening. Eventually, Matt got up to check the generator. I don't think he wanted to go out there alone, but neither of us said it, so I followed him downstairs while Emily and Sarah stayed upstairs. The moment we stepped outside, I knew we were done. There were footprints everywhere, bare human footprints. They circled the cabin, leading up to the windows, the doors, the shed. Some of them were on top of our own tracks from yesterday, meaning whoever or whatever had been out here had been watching us for longer than we thought. But the worst part was the trail that led away from the back door. Matt pointed at them, eyes narrowed. At first, they were bare human feet, clear imprints in the fresh snow. But a few steps away from the cabin, something changed. The prints shifted, the toes elongated, the arch disappeared, the weight distribution changed. By the time they reached the tree line, they weren't human anymore. They were animal tracks, wolf, maybe. But bigger, Matt just stared for a long time before shaking his head and saying, "We're leaving." That was it. No argument, no discussion. We were done. We grabbed our stuff and packed in record time, barely saying a word as we threw our bags into the camper van. I remember feeling like we weren't moving fast enough, like every second spent outside was another chance for whatever had been circling us to come back. By the time I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands were shaking. Matt sat beside me, Emily and Sarah in the back. I turned the key and the engine rumbled to life. It was only when I put the van in drive and started pulling out onto the dirt road that I felt my pulse begin to settle. We were leaving. It was over. Then Emily spoke. She was looking out the window, voice quiet, almost unsure. "She's watching us." I didn't want to look, but I did. There, standing just beyond the tree line, was a woman. She wasn't moving. She wasn't walking toward us. She was just standing there, pale, thin, still, watching. I gripped the wheel tighter, forcing myself to look straight ahead as I pressed down harder on the gas. The tires slipped slightly against the snow-packed dirt road. And for a brief, horrible second, I thought we'd get stuck. But then we were moving, and I didn't stop. No one looked back. We didn't speak until we were miles away, deep enough into civilization that our phones finally started buzzing with notifications. We haven't been back since.